Welcome back to the channel, everyone. I'm Ben, and this is the new Made in USA 2024 Epiphone Coronet. Let's get into it. I'm sure everyone has seen the Epiphone Coronet, even if you haven't necessarily heard of it by name. They came out with this design about 65 years ago, and even though it hasn't remained in production the whole time, they have had a few limited runs here and there of this particular model. In 1990, for example, there was a simultaneous release of Korean-made coronets and US-made coronets, and both of these were wildly different from the original coronet in that they both had two pickups. The US model had active pickups with a baritone selector. The Korean version had like Bill Lawrence pickups in it, which are pretty awesome and rare. And the US model had also a hockey stick headstock, which is way different than this model, obviously, and what was traditionally on a coronet. Now, the point of all this is to say that the last time the US released a coronet, it was wildly different spec-wise from the original coronet, and basically it just carried the same look, and that's kind of it. So I'm actually pretty excited to dive into this one and see what makes it tick and, you know, just play around with it and see how it is as a guitar. Now, as a reference, I do have a 2020 Epiphone Coronet, and I'm not going to be doing a deep dive on this as well. If you guys want me to do that, let me know and I'll gladly rip it apart and tell you everything about it. But for this video, I'm going to focus just on this guitar, and when applicable, I may pull this out as a reference. We'll see. Anyway, with that being said, let's get into it. As a US model, this thing retails for Gibson money, and that's right, this thing costs $1,700, which puts it right on par with a Les Paul Jr., both in features and almost the price, except this guitar is $100 more than the Les Paul Jr. from Gibson, which is pretty crazy if you ask me. Now, as a reference, the Made in China Epiphone Coronet retails for about $550, so that puts the US model at just over 3 times the cost of the Chinese-made counterpart, which is pretty insane if you ask me. Moving on to the case, well, we get a black faux leather rectangle case with the vintage Epiphone logo. Notice the last E is capitalized and the J a bit different than the modern Epi logo today. Moving into the case, there's a nice plush deep blue interior that I actually really like. It's very soft and very cushiony for this guitar. And there's a nice big pocket in here too. We open it up and what? Gibson stuff? Inside the Epi or Gibson goodie bag, we've got the Gibson owner's manual, Gibson warranty card, Gibson multi-tool, an ad for the Gibson app, a Gibson strap, a Gibson polishing cloth, and yes, it's 2 black top hat knobs in case you don't like the cream carousel knobs that come standard on this model. Now, in case it isn't obvious, this guitar is made by Gibson in Nashville, and I'm pretty sure everybody knows that. It's the same parent company, so it makes sense that they would use the facilities that are already available here. What does surprise me is that for a $1,700 guitar that still says Epiphone on it, they don't go through the trouble of giving you like an Epiphone polishing cloth or an Epiphone strap or maybe an Epiphone warranty card. I did think that was a little strange. So this release of the Coronet is the late 50s symmetrical look of the Epiphone Coronet. It's very bare bones, no nonsense styling. And I kind of had a similar thought, but with a more negative connotation when I saw it the first time. Of $1,700, it's pretty bare bones, especially when you consider that you can get a Les Paul Jr. with a burst at least, or even a tortoiseshell pickguard, and it's $100 less. But that being said, here it is in all its glory. It's available right now in 2 different finishes. This is the vintage cherry, and there is an ebony finish as well. But I went with the vintage cherry because lately, for whatever reason, I've had this fascination with the wood grain, whereas, you know, like 5 years ago, everything had to be black or ebony. And I don't know, it's a very, I just like seeing it. I don't know, maybe I'm just getting old or something like that. There is a charm to the simplicity, I will give it that. You've got one pickup, you've got your wraparound bridge, and just the controls for that pickup as well. It's hard to fault that. I don't know. It's just, on one hand, I like it. On one hand, it's very bare. I don't know. I'm split right down the middle. In case you were wondering, this Coronet does have a nitrocellulose finish. As you know, with Gibson, nitrocellulose is king. Whereas if you were to get the Epiphone model, the made in Chinese one, you're going to get a traditional poly coat on this. You know, there's pluses and minuses to each one. The body is a 2-piece mahogany slab split right down the middle here. This one in particular is about 1.3 .375 inches. And I think that's the first major difference we run into between this model and the original 1959 model. That model had a 1.75 inch thick body. So this body's a bit thinner for sure. Now Epiphone says that this body is better balanced and a little bit lighter weight, and I think the latter statement is pretty obvious, right? But we'll check the balance when we hit the neck dive section in the feel portion of this video. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it is a symmetrical cut, as you can see there. The body joins the neck right at the very last fret there, the 22nd fret, just like the Les Paul double cut. Now, I read a funny story about this design inside of the Gibson historian Walter Carter's Epiphone book. Basically, Gibson was not really in the business of copying other guitars and, looking like they were in second place. But when they acquired Epiphone, they said, who cares, it's Epiphone, right? And basically what you do is you take a Telecaster, split it in half, flip one half over the other, and what design do you get? You get this, the 1959 Coronet. I don't think it's a coincidence either that the original Coronet had a 1.75 inch slab body, just like the 1.75 inch slab Telecaster body. When it comes to the neck, you've got a solid mahogany construction here, set neck as well. You've got the wings glued to the side of the headstock here, just like most Epiphones or Gibson guitars. Now, this new USA Coronet does not have a bound fretboard, just like the original, and that fits in with its line of being a budget guitar, at least back in the day it was. Now, for the USA Coronet, I am reading a 1.71 inches here on the nut, which is a bit thicker than the original nut that was released in 1958. Gibson claims they widened this nut so that it was a better playing experience that fit more in with our modern playing styles. Sure, it also probably doesn't hurt that all their machining is set up for this exact nut either, but that's just a guess. When it comes to fret thickness, I'm getting a 0.82 on the first fret, and at the 12th fret, I'm getting a 0.93, putting it right in the spec'd slim taper category. Now for the radius, I'm getting a 12-inch all the way through the whole thing, as expected. Now here's a little profile shot of what I was getting on the neck in the 1st and the 12th frets, and you can see it's a little bit more meatier on the bass side of the higher frets. Now, to answer my own question that I had about this guitar when I found out it was a USA model was, what am I going to get for the angles on this thing? Well, if I lay the body flat and I set the body to a 0, because it is just a flat slab, on the neck back angle I'm getting about 3 degrees. If I zero in on the neck and I take a measurement on the headstock, I get about an 18-degree back, which puts it squarely in line with the Gibson production line. That doesn't surprise me one bit. It is just a little bit interesting though, because generally Epiphones have a much shallower angle when it comes to the headstocks. As you can see, this one's sitting at about 14 degrees. Now this guitar does have a very long neck tenon, which a lot of you will like, I'm sure, and that's because the neck pretty much mounts at the very last possible place on the fretboard there. Makes total sense, right? Now let's talk about the hardware on this guitar, and let's start at the very bottom. Well, this guitar has what I would consider are the flattened mushroom strap buttons there, and that's another difference that this guitar had on the original one from the 1950s. Back then, they put the strap button here at the center of the neck where it hits the body. And if you look at these Epiphone Coronets all over the internet, you can see many, almost everyone that I saw, own or moved or added the button to the top of the horn here. Well, it seems like Gibson did the dirty work for us and just decided to put it in there at the top of the horn for us so we don't have to worry about drilling a new hole in there. And that makes sense. This is actually a pretty small body, so that would have been a weird place to have the strap almost like a belt on your body wrapping around just to get this guitar sitting there. So I think that's a good move, even though it isn't really historically accurate. Now moving on from there, we move to the jack plate, and you can see it's a nice shiny chrome there. That is really nice. I like that it's metal and not plastic. Always a good move in my book. Now let's move to the front of this beast here. You can see we've got a wraparound bridge there, complete with set screws to adjust the intonation. I think these bridges are kind of fun because, at least in my mind, you can sort of feel the strings sliding around. It feels a little dangerous, but it also has this really nice quality to it that's hard to really explain here. Now, where these bridges do suck is that they don't really get you 100% intonation. You can never really get 100% intonation, I don't think, but when you compare it to a Tune-o-matic or something like that, the differences between where each string sits are always going to modify where the other one's at with each adjustment or turn of the screw. So you'll see sometimes people replace these with the adjustable wraparound bridges, kind of like Iomi has on his SG, for example. I know you can't see it, but just so that you know, there is also a metal mounting plate underneath the soap bar pickup there. That is also pretty expected, I'm sure. Moving up to the fretboard here, we've got medium jumbo frets. And then we move on to the truss rod, and that was another question I had. Well, yes, this guitar does have the Gibson style truss rod underneath there as opposed to the Epiphone's dual action truss rod. So some people are going to like that and some people are going to dislike that, of course. Moving on to these tuners here, well, you've got the deluxe Gibson style tuners there. Now these tuning keys are 6 individual tuning keys. That is a bit different from the original model, which had 3 on a plate on each side. I don't know why they changed that, but that's the case there. And just in case you're curious, the ratio on these is a 14:1. And of course, at the top of this guitar here, we've got the infamous Epiphone brass bikini badge. And just in case you're curious, this guitar comes with a regular set of strings. That would be the 10, the 13, 17, 26, 36, and 46 regular strings. So let's talk about when the Coronet was first released in the late 50s. Gibson had a stockpile of these New York pickups and they didn't really want to deal with them anymore. They had their own pickup line. So for the first 6 months to a year or so, the Coronets were loaded with the New York Epiphone pickup. And when that supply eventually ran out, they replaced it with P90s, which is the particular pickup that Gibson decided to put inside this re-release of the Epiphone Coronet. Now for the readings on this soap bar pickup, I'm getting a 7.72. So I'm guessing this is one of the Alnico 5 soap bar pickups, as those generally read a bit hotter than the Alnico 3 soap bar pickups, which are available from Gibson. If we flip this guitar over and we look inside the control cavity, it's a very basic setup here. We've got 2 500K CTS pots, a master volume and a master tone, and an orange drop capacitor in there. Now I was a bit surprised to see that it's wired with the modern wiring as opposed to the vintage wiring, but I guess that's just what they decided to do. I mean, one pickup, it's pretty basic controls, right? Now when it comes to other materials, let's start down here at the bottom. We've got these vintage era correct carousel knobs, and you don't really see these pop up too often. Whenever they do pop up on Reverb, I think they're selling for way too much money. But I think it's a really nice touch, and I think it's really cool that they did that. But you did see that Gibson also threw in the black top hat knobs in case you want to change your Coronet over to the early 60s look when the Coronet started to sport those. And maybe this is just another one of those, you know, they had so many of them left over from the Epiphone days and they were waiting till the stock ran out. I don't know. But moving on from there, we've got our black soap bar pickup cover. We've got this really thick single ply white pickguard, and that is also vintage era accurate. Now one thing that was a bit of a bummer, I don't think you can see it here, but I'll do a close-up on my video. There's about a 1/2 inch gouge in the pickguard here when I pulled it out of the case. Now I was really curious how customer support would work with this model since it's a USA Epiphone. So I called up Epiphone, told them the situation. They said, that's a real bummer, you're probably gonna have to send the entire guitar back, which is kind of Epiphone's MO. But they said they would run it through the support team and see what happens. Well, about 10 minutes later, support got in touch with me and said, we actually don't handle that guitar. You're going to want to contact Gibson in Nashville. Good luck. So I called Gibson in Nashville and they said, yeah, we'll send you a new pickguard, no problem. It'll be there in about a week, maybe something like that. So the whole process only took me about 30 minutes, which sending back an entire guitar for pickguard, that's a much bigger inconvenience. I can assure you of that. So anyway, long story short, if you have any problems with your Epiphone USA Coronet, just call Gibson and cut the middleman out. That's my pro tip today. Now, sorry about that little diatribe. Let's move on from there. Underneath the strap buttons here, you've got a little bit of black felt. I don't know if you can see that there, but it's on both the top and the bottom button. And then we move to the neck, which has these plastic or acrylic dot inlays, and it's got matching ones there on the side of the fretboard all the way down the entire fretboard, which is nice. I don't know why sometimes guitars stop doing them after like the 17th fret, even though the other markers go down there. It's a weird thing to me. Moving on up, we have a Graphtec nut here, and then just beyond that we've got a period accurate truss rod cover there. It's 3-ply black, white, black, and it actually looks a lot like what they had back in the 1950s, complete with the 2 screws. very cool there if you ask me. Now up to the headstock here, we've got these little cream bean tuning keys. They're probably my least favorite tuning keys of all time, but they are period accurate, so I will give them credit for that. On the back side of the guitar here, we've got this triangular cavity plate, which is different from the original model, which had more of like a elongated pill shape. I don't know why they went with that. Maybe it's just quicker to manufacture and do a bigger route to get the jack in there or something like that. Who knows? Now when this guitar arrived set up from the factory, it was actually pretty good. It was set up for 10s, as I mentioned, it came with those before. Now I have a custom set of strings that I use from Stringjoy, and this is not sponsored by Stringjoy by any means, but it's a string that I've sort of tailored to my fingers and my playing style. That's a 9.5 to 42 hybrid there. And so I did have to do a little bit of tweaking with the intonation and a little bit with, just a very little bit with the truss rod, just to get this guitar to play to my liking. But that being said, it actually plays really good. As mentioned before, it does have this Telecaster sort of squared edge feel to it, so it's not really the most comfortable guitar if you're sitting there and playing it, because you can feel these hard edges digging into your ribs or some other parts here like your arm resting on it. But if you can play a Telecaster and you're used to that feeling, then this is no problem at all. It is a little bit thinner than a Telecaster, which is actually kind of nice. Now, as I mentioned before, Epiphone purposely thinned out this guitar to make it a little bit lighter. And I was actually surprised at how light it was. When I pulled the case out of the box and I measured everything, the case with the guitar in it, it came out to 22 pounds. And I was very surprised then to learn that the guitar is only 6.5 pounds of that, actually right on the dot, 6.5 pounds, which means that's a very heavy case. Now, I would much rather have a light guitar in a heavy case than a heavy guitar in a light case. Nobody likes heavy guitars, right? As for the neck dive test, I'm going to give it a solid A. Neck up, neck down, neck middle. It seems to stay more or less where it's at with just a basic 2-inch strap, and that's always a winner in my book. Now when it comes to the sound test, we've obviously only got one pickup, a volume, and a tone selector here, so it's not going to be the most extensive sound testing, but I will give you a little bit of clean tones, a little bit of crunch, and I'll mess with the volumes and the tones and just sort of get some general sounds and see what I come up with here. So here we are at the end of my video where I give you my final thoughts, and in return maybe you do a reply and give me your final thoughts, which I'm very curious to hear about. Now this guitar is definitely not my favorite release of the year. It is very fun and it does fit in with my playing style, and you know, it's basically a rebadged Gibson, and I've got a lot of Gibsons, and so I'm very familiar with how those play, and this is no different than that. Of course, you've got your P90s and a very simple wiring, so in a way, I kind of knew how this guitar was going to sound, and I'm sure a lot of you knew how this guitar was going to sound as well. It does roar. It's a lot of fun. I knew exactly what to expect, and I got it. Now let's move on to the bad stuff. I do think this guitar is way overpriced. Now going back to Walter Carter's Epiphone book, there's a great anecdote in there where after Gibson acquires Epiphone, Ted McCarty has this speech that he gives to everyone, or a memo or whatever, and it says,
"To ensure the success of both Gibson and Epiphone, an Epiphone can never be equal with Gibson."
And for example, you had the Les Paul Jr. come out, and then you had the Coronet come out, and the Coronet was basically a cheaper, less fashionable version of the Les Paul Jr., and I guess that was success for both companies. So here we are now, 60-something years later, and we've got the Coronet re-released, and it's $100 more than a Les Paul Jr. That's a little crazy to me, I think. Not only that, but it's several $100 more than the Les Paul Modern Lite, which has 2 pickups, 2 sets of controls, an arch top, and a tunematic bridge. Or the SG Special, which in my opinion is a better guitar than this, has 2 P90s and controls for each, and it has a cool nickname, the Red Devil. So I'm not quite sure where this fits in the Gibson Epiphone line of guitars. It's on its way to being a proper historic remake, but then it makes several left turns along the way that pull it out from that. And so for like $1,700, I want that extra thick body. I want the pill-shaped cavity back here. I want the 3-on-a-plate tuners. I want the slightly narrower nut that was on the old model. I think this guitar should have been like $1,200 or something like that. But anyway, that's my thoughts on this guitar. I'm curious to see what you guys have to say about it. If you'd like to leave a comment, please do. If you like this video, please click the like button. And if you feel like subscribing, please do that as well. Anyway, guys, I'll catch up with you next time.